and welcome to APJ Chat, a special program brought to you by the Africa Policy Journal at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Muhammad Jamil Yusha, and I am the editor-in-chief of Africa Policy Journal, and I will be your host for the program today. We have a special guest, Professor Daniel Agbiboa, who is an assistant professor in African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Professor Daniel recently published a book that attracted attention on the informal sector in Africa. And that will be the subject of our conversation today. Professor Daniel, it's really a pleasure to have you here today. You presented such a very beautiful presentation at the Malkin House at the Kennedy School, which was in a nutshell a summary of your book on the role of informal transport sector in Africa, taking Nigeria as your case study. My first question to you is, why select that topic? People would say, why don't you go for something fancy and everything? What's your motivation to look at the informal transport sector?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Fancy, I would say I struggle to find any sector that is more fancier than the informal transport. I mean, just the slogans, the pictures, the graffitis, the color that they bring to the African city means that for city dwellers in Africa, it's almost impossible to imagine their city without these popular means of transport. Why did I select the informal transport sector? I think for me, it's both a lived experience in the sense that I used them growing up in Lagos. And I was always curious about the slogans that are written on them, about the actors within this sector who seem to be, of whom many people have opinions, often not good opinions. The last thing you want your child to be growing up is to be a danfo driver. So they have a bad reputation, and they could be understood within the logic of what the sociologist Irving Goffman calls dirty workers. But I think the choice to do research, to study this sector was even more personal in the sense that my parents dabbled into the sector as a mode of survival in the early 1990s, just on the back of the crisis of the structural adjustment program at a time when Nigerian civil servants were looking for alternative means of survival, or rather complementary means of survival. So this was a time when my parents started to think, well, maybe the informal transport sector is a good sector to go into, acquire a minibus taxi, and they could see the multiple role that minibus taxi would play, right? The minibus taxi could take their children to school, but also make money. So this sort of blurred boundary between the public and the private was something that was attractive to them, but it was a disaster. Disaster for them in the sense that they ended up losing significantly the money that was invested in the sector. In fact, the danfo became a monster almost that swallows their money. And for us, it was a traumatic experience because
can you explain more about that? How did they lose the money?
Yes.
It's supposed to complement their income.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, which is the paradox. For us, it was a traumatic experience in the sense that on one hand, it was traumatic in the sense that there were frequent bitter arguments between my parents and the danfo driver who was employed through apparently a trusted network. But also, I think for us, it was also, there was a joy, there was a pride in owning means of transport, however old, however rickety it is. So there was that mixed feeling for us that we knew something was not quite right. We knew from the emotions, the negative emotions, that this business was not going according to plan. How was it not going according to plan? Well, there was a sense in which they were investing a lot of money in, and there was a sense from their own perspective that the driver was colluding with, or even the motorbike touts, the agberos as they call them, to extort money from them. So this was their own perspective. And as children, we never really learned the perspective of the danfo driver, what was going on there. And that was part of the curiosity, to understand the story from the perspective of this actor that is seen as dishonest, this actor that is seen as collusive, this actor that is seen as nobody.
That's quite interesting. So fast forward, it seems that your experience as a child has really inspired your desire to conduct a research in this area.
Yes.
So when did you make that final decision? And can you also share with us highlights of that research when you delve into it?
Absolutely. So I think my interest in studying the informal transport sector is intimately connected to my interest in understanding corruption. My primary interest was to understand not political or grand or high-level corruption as is always the focus in both academic and policy research. But it was to understand the corruption that I was most intimately aware of, which was the corruption that takes place on an everyday basis, the corruption at checkpoints, things that we observed while going to school. And for a long time, I bought into this idea that they were disconnected, right? That everyday, what is sometimes called petty corruption, which sort of trivializes it, is different and less important in comparison to state capture and state level corruption, which was the focus of anti-corruption campaigns in Nigeria and more broadly Africa. It was about catching these rogue politicians and putting them in prison, right? But then, when I approached my supervisor, Abdurrahfu Mustafa, who unfortunately passed away at the time of my graduation, he said to me, that's an interesting topic, but you need to ground it, right? It's broad. You need to try to ground it. And I thought, where do I ground my interest in everyday corruption? Well, I went back to my childhood, right? What was the sector that was most closest to that everyday corruption? For me, it was the informal transport. It was on the roads, more traveled. And so hence I started to think about how do I understand everyday corruption in the context of transport? And it was there that I began to see that it's not as disconnected as you might think, that this pettiness of corruption is very much tied to the grandness of corruption.
That's quite interesting because at the time, Nigeria has been grappling with the issues of fighting corruption.
Yes.
In the late 1990s to early 2000s, the government established two major institutions, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission and the Independent and Corrupt Practices Commission.
Yes.
And conventional thinking might say you will put your searchlight on the grand corruption.
Yes.
But you narrow it down to petty corruption.
Yes.
And you feel that it's a reflection of society. Why was that?
Yes. In actual fact, I appended it, right? I expanded it to everyday corruption because I actually think everyday corruption is embedded within the social. So it's much wider and broader than the narrow focus on grand corruption. And I did that because the transport sector allowed me to see in that sort of expansive and complementary way, in the sense that the focus on the EFCC was what everybody did.
Yeah.
But it wasn't satisfactory. It didn't satisfy me intellectually because I sort of felt that corruption was more complex than it was being portrayed, certainly from my own experience, from what was not said in terms of the glance, the emotions that were expressed by transport operators fighting with a motor packed out in full view of a traffic police inspector. I felt that it was much thicker, it was more textured than EFCC would portray it. I mean, I'm not saying that is not an important approach. I'm just saying that there's a disconnect between the street level and the state level. And moreover, what it missed as well in analysis of organizations like the EFCC watchdog was that it missed the whole way in which corruption in Nigeria fights back. So you don't just fight corruption. And we know what happened to people who fight corruption, not just in Nigeria, Kenya, and across Africa. But more interestingly, transport allowed me to see the complexity of corruption in the sense that I'm looking at this motor packed out and I'm saying, and I'm beginning to realize that the money that is accumulated by this motor packed out finds its way one way or the other to party politics. And they make millions of dollars from that sector. And how did I find my way to that? It was through the popular rumors that were embedded within this sector. People had a strong sense that the motor packed out who worked for the union, the National Union of Road Transport Workers, were untouchables. They were children of the government, precisely because of the patronage network within which they are embedded, which made them untouchable. And so the transport operator, more often than not, will say, I don't argue with them, I just give them what they want and I go on my way. So this was something that was really interesting, even if you think about post-1999 Lagos with the emergence of technocratic leaders like Bola Ahmed Tinubu and Fashola, who came in with the whole world-class city imaginary and repairing the damage of Lagos. One of the sector that was untouchable was the informal transport sector, but in particular, the National Union of Road Transport Workers. they somehow continued and persisted despite the campaign to renew Lagos, which tells you that the power that they possess is very much embedded within the state. And these are not just actors that are co-opted passively within the states. They also, they are capable of acting as much as they are being acted upon by the state.
This is quite interesting because you seem to be now delving into the nitty-gritty of the issue.
Yes.
I'm curious to know because it's a very complex sector.
Yes.
And it's all over the society.
Yes.
You know, it's a common feature of many of our societies. How did you delve into the inner cycles of the transport workers? What have you done differently in order to unearth the information that you have?
Yes.
You know, one of the things that attracted me in your book is the title.
Yes,
The
absolutely.
Eat Our Sweat.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us more?
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot in there that I can unpack. First, it strikes me that for a sector that is so dominant, so visible in everyday life, that they are invisibilized in academic research. Very few academic works. In fact, I don't know of any book that has written about the National Union of Road Transport Workers. How so? Perhaps the power of the union itself lies in its capacity to evade attention, its capacity to be shadowy.
Yes.
And plus, if you combine that with a culture in Nigeria where people say, don't even go near the union, you know, it's in that very sense that they are untouchable, that their power is perpetuated. Because people then don't study them, people overlook them, even though they are the most obvious thing you would see when you come to Lagos on the road. So I think for me, that was the push to try to understand this sector that is at once relegated to the margins, even at the same time they are central to the politics of everyday life in Nigeria. So how do I study a group like this? I think for me, my first thought was ethnography. I wanted to, I realized the topic that I was looking at, as you say, is thicker, is textured, is complex. And ethnography allows me, rather than survey question or elite-based interview, allowed me to capture that very ambiguity, that very complex, that the union, that is embodied by the union. So in essence, then how do I understand this complex system from within, rather than from the outside? And which is why then I became a downfall conductor for a while to try to understand the experience, the lived experience of workers in this sector.
You mean you became a conductor?
Yes,
in
absolutely.
the bus, working with a driver?
Yes, absolutely. Which was a chance encounter, in fact, because it was a childhood friend who had gone on to be a downfall conductor. And when I encountered him on the streets of Lagos, in Alimosho local government, to be precise, which is the largest local government area in Lagos, he said to me, you know, you're better off trying to study this thing from within. And one way of doing that is first to experience what it feels like to be a downfall driver and a downfall operator. Yeah. So it was a crazy thought, but then I said, why not? Why not? Let's give it a go. So that was it. Yes.
Tell us the journey of being a conductor, a PhD researcher.
Yes.
From Oxford.
Yes.
Now a bus conductor.
Yes.
Please
take
us through that journey.
No. So this was based in Alimosho, and we would usually run the roads from Alimosho to Oshodi, which is the central hub in Lagos. You know, people always joke that anywhere you're going to in Lagos, to get to Oshodi, you find your way. So it's this complex, intricate hub, giant local government area. So we would navigate both places. It was difficult because I think one thing you don't understand when you look at a conductor is that you think about this sector as being this unskilled sector. But what you quickly realize is that there is a certain skill in knowing how to hop the downfall, how to come down, when to ask for money, how to multitask, how to concept. The one thing that was most striking was the level of vigilance that is required and the level of coordination that is required to be a downfall conductor. But you also have to develop a thick skin because people literally see you as a conductor, right? And people are worried because if you hold on to their change for too long, they would start screaming because they feel like you're trying to extort them. You're trying to, purloin them. So there were all those soft and hard aspects. There was this aspect of just feeling worthless, just feeling like you are not seen as treated as a human being that is associated with the sector, the stigma of being a downfall conductor. But beyond that as well, there was just a challenge, just the physical and mental exhaustion that comes with the sector of dealing with passengers who already have preconceived notion of you as being an armed robber, really, and dealing with motor-packed touts who don't want to hear anything. They don't want no story, as they say in Lagos, which is the simple sort of thing to say to you, which is, where's the money? We don't have time, because they also have to collect their money and meet their own sort of target. And the brutality of the sector, a brutality that was often not present. It was just implied. It was anticipated. It was there, but not there, spectral in a sense. So it was just exhausting physically and mentally. And as I say, this was only a couple of months. I just could not do anymore. It was just impossible to continue as a conductor, which tells you a lot.
That's quite interesting.
Yes.
Great viewers, this is Professor Daniel from the Harvard University Department of African and African American Studies. We are talking about his groundbreaking research on the informal transport sector in Nigeria here in APJ Chat, brought to you directly from the Africa Policy Journal. And I am Muhammad Jamil Yusha. Daniel, this is quite fascinating for you to survive 2 months as a conductor, absorbing all the stigma and all the difficulties. What are the policy issues that you have uncovered from this research that you would like to share with us?
Absolutely. So great question. I think when I look back and I combine my experience as a conductor with my own lived experience of Lagos, so sort of an outsider within the system, just the conversations you hear when you're in the damn pool tells you that Nigerians are one of the most critical people of corruption. Which is a paradox, because Nigerians also have the reputation of being one of the most corrupt people in the world. So the perception and the reality is very, it's miles apart. So Nigerians would, and you see that as well, even in the elections, the Nigerians are very critical of the process. They are very critical of due process and the way in which they have a sense of how things should unfold. So that's the first thing. And I say, from a policy perspective, how do we work with that? How do we work with people's desire for better? How do we work with people's positive critique of a system? They are critiquing it not to destroy it, but to build it up. Right? This is why you think about like the NSAS protesters were on the streets marching. They were with their national flag. They were singing the national anthem. So they were anything but unpatriotic. So Nigerians are like to think of as people who have an innate desire for a better life and are critical of any policy, any sort of none that goes against that desire for better. But how come that they are also implicated in the corruption? That's another paradox that I saw. Nigerians denounce corruption, but they reproduce it on a daily basis. So that's one of the area that I wanted to try to understand in the book. How is it that people reproduce the very thing that they criticize? And Daniel Jordan Smith has done some work in this area in his book on corruption, focusing mostly in southeastern Nigeria. And I wanted to look at that in the context of the Southwest, specifically in the context of Lagos. And one of the discoveries that I made was that people's reproduction of corruption was out of, in some sense, they were compelled by the environment, the context in which they lived, in a context in which not to give into corruption, not to engage with corruption, is to become anonymous, is to really die a social death, and sometimes quite literally a physical death, because you could be killed as a conductor if you refuse, or a driver if you refuse to give in to the request for money by these admirals, these motor-packed touts. So I think there's something to be looked at in the sense that how do we, from a policy perspective, connect state-level corruption to street-level corruption?
Interesting.
Because I actually believe that it's impossible to deal with corruption without embedding it within the social. And I think there's been a disconnect between the economic and the social. And we need to re-embed economic policies, which the EFCC represents, for example, in the very name of the institute. How do we tie that back to the social, to the jokes, to the rumors, to the gossips, to the conversations that people have? And how do we operate from a perspective that there's nothing inherently corrupt about Nigeria, that people have a negative emotion towards corruption, and that we can work with that from a place of hope rather than a place of despair.
So that emotion can be transformed into a data.
Absolutely.
That can be utilized actually.
Absolutely. And people's desire for a better life. The rallying slogan is Lagos is a Koni Baje. Lagos will not go to ruin. And it embodies these positive emotions that Lagosians have and this love that they have for their city. So I think that's something from a policy perspective to work with people, not against people. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case because the language of the city has always been the language of banning, the language of moving people away from the center to the margins. And it's an anti-people policy.
This is a very important point that you have raised, which I think is good to look at it in more detail.
Yes.
From your explanation, this is a very complex and culturally rooted institution, the informal transport sector.
Yes.
Now, you had very modernizing leadership, especially in Lagos State, since the return of the country to democracy in 1999. And there is this tendency, not in Lagos, but in many African countries, to come up with a policy from the top. These are informal transport workers. They are a nuisance. We don't want to see it.
Yes.
We ban it.
Yes.
Take them out. Come and replace it with modern institutions.
Yes.
And in some instances, it doesn't work.
Yes.
So how do you, from your research, how should governments approach this kind of complexities?
Yes. I think in most instances, it doesn't work. I think we can begin first by the language that we use. We call them informal actors. And when you think about informality, what's another word for informality? Well, informality, if we were to align it with something else, it would be illegality, right?
Yep.
And so hence, governors from around the world, urban governors went to the new urban agenda hosted in Quito in Ecuador a few years ago. And one of the lines in that new urban agenda document was to formalize the informal. So they went back and said, well, let's formalize the informal. We're going to have to pull down and destroy these informal means of transport because they do not represent what it means to be modern. So is there a world in which the downfall can be part of the modern? No, because there's a singular notion of modernity and hence informal transport workers do not fit within that model. So what do? You create a dedicated lane for bus rapid transit system and you ban Okadas. And you ban Okadas being motorcycles, and you ban the motorways, the midi buses. And I'm thinking again, going back to my policy recommendation about, is that the way to go about it, to treat these contexts as sort of a blank slate? Or are there benefits? Are there things that these forms of popular transport bring to the table that you can work with, that you can retrain people, that you can integrate them within the system? Because they too are part of the city and they have the right to be part of decision-making processes that impact on their lives. So I think a policy that works with rather than against the people and that reframes the kind of language, the kind of way in which we think about informality, that puts them within the sphere of the illegal and therefore sees their forms of livelihood as disposable. I think that's problematic. And by the way, this is not unique to Lagos or Nigeria at all. This is something happening across Africa and even beyond, I would say.
The continent. So I think actually I wanted to touch on that, the applicability of the research in other African contexts. But beyond that, a lot of these African countries and many developing countries, they look for financing, especially from major financing institutions, who on many occasions comes with this modernizing idea without understanding the cultural context. How could these institutions and the governments in Africa create a balance between the desire to modernize and understand that there are also lives that will be touched negatively if this modernizing agenda is not handled, with the balance that it requires?
So how do you convince them? I could write an article, but nobody's going to read it. I mean, maybe a few people download it. A few people download, maybe 10, 15 people. Maybe if I do a blog, maybe more people would read it. But I think the way you convince policymakers and financial institutions is by saying, to what extent do you think that your own innovation has worked? Let's take the bus rapid transit system, heavily funded by the World Bank, right? In Lagos. Is the bus rapid transit system a success? Well, the last time I was in Lagos, they look like the downfalls that they were meant to replace. they piecemeal in terms of the places that they operate in. The maintenance culture has caught up with them. So it becomes the lines between the downfalls, the informal and the apparently formal BRTs is just not clear anymore. One thing I'm saying is that there's a sense in which a policy that is designed not just to include the excluded, but to include them under terms that do justice to them, to their livelihoods. I think what happened was that informal transport workers were, not that they were excluded from the whole BRT processes. There were some meetings with some union members. But it was the sense in which the terms under which they were included meant that their voice was not clearly represented in the final agenda. So the policy for the policymakers and the financial institutions is saying your own approach hasn't worked or hasn't worked well enough, which means that you have to go back to the drawing board and say, why has it not worked? And we see a similar thing happening in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where you have the minibus taxis, the dalas, where it seems that a kind of approach that is emerging is sort of this hybrid approach where these bus rapid transit systems are working side by side with the dala informal minibus taxi sector to work with them rather than against them, right? This is not a space of replacing. It's a place of how to harness the skills and how do we harness the cultures and that these forms of transport bring in. So I think that's something similar to what we can do in Nigeria. This is not at all to say that there are no problems in the informal transport sector, to romanticize them. I mean, the informal transport workers are the first people to tell you that there is a huge problem within the sector, but they want to know that the policies that are created includes them, but includes them in a way that actually takes their voices seriously, rather than just includes them in a very superficial way. They want a city that is green. They want a city that is beautiful. They want to be modern. But what is the place for them within that? Is there a place for them within that sector? Are they just going to be replaced? Are they disposable? I think that's where the problem lies. Can we find policies that are not activists that actually take the experiences, the voices of people seriously? I think this is important when dealing with especially Africa. And I always recall an article, one of my favorites of Chinua Achebe, Africa is people, he says. Can we have policies that treat Africa as people?
I think that's the best way to end this interview.
Yes.
Find the people at the center.
Yes. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniel.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I wish we could continue with this fascinating interview, but time has, is against us, and therefore we have to round up here. I'm really grateful to Professor Daniel for giving us the time to, share his thoughts about this groundbreaking research, which has now been published into a book called They Eat Our Sweat.
Yes.
And I think it's a very interesting book, and we hope that it can contribute in improving policy. On behalf of the entire team at the Africa Policy Journal, our interview team, our colleague Adao B, who has been working behind the scene to make sure that this APJ Chat is successful, I, the Editor-in-Chief of Africa Policy Journal, Muhammad Jamil Yusha, saying goodbye and see you in the next episode.